Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of our Colson Center short course. My name is Steve Verley. I am the Chief Operating Officer at the Colson Center. I'm standing in for John Stonestreet, or sitting in, I should say, since I'm sitting in for John Stonestreet today with our guest, Scott Klusendorf. I'll let Scott kind of outline today's agenda. Just a few housekeeping items. You're probably tired of us telling you this since you've been with us for 3 or 4 weeks now, but you'll have two windows or two buttons on your screen, depending on what device you're on. They might say something different, but one of them is a chat window, and that will be used for us to send information to you, as well as if you have any questions whatsoever for Scott. Roughly an hour into the presentation, after Scott gives his presentation, we'll be doing 30 minutes of Q&A. And if you have any questions at all, you can type them in at any time in the chat window. I will pick them up and feed them to Scott, and we'll address those in the second 30 minutes of our talk. You can also type in things to the Q&A window once the Q&A session starts, because sometimes the answer to question 1 will lead to question 2. So we welcome you to do that. There's also a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen, or once again, someplace on your device. If you have any technical issues, Heidi is helping us with this today. So audio issues, video issues, etc., or just general questions. Please type those into the Q&A window. Scott has a PDF that he's going to be walking through for part of today's presentation. Heidi has put a link to that in the chat window, so any of you that want to can go to that window now and pick that off. If you click on it, you should be able to pull that document up, and that'll enable you to walk through that, or at least look at that while Scott is walking through that. As in previous weeks, once the video is done, or once the session is done, we're recording this, obviously, and everybody that's registered for this short course will get a recording that you can watch to review this, share it with your friends and family. We just ask that you not post the video to social media, and other resources that Scott mentions, including the PDF that we include in the chat window here, will be mailed out to you after the event as well. So with that, I will turn my camera off and turn it over to Scott, and I will come back in about an hour when Scott wraps up, and we'll do our questions and answer session. Thank you. All yours, Scott.
Thank you, Steve. Let's go ahead and have a moment of prayer, and we'll get started. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this final opportunity to come together, to equip ourselves to defend life. I pray that the material will bear fruit, that all those engaged in this webinar will take what they've learned and apply it where you have placed them strategically to make a difference. We ask this for your son's sake. Amen. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to be with you one last time. I'm going to miss this. Hopefully you will as well. Quick review of where we've come from in case you have not been with us, or maybe you missed 1 or 2 of the earlier sessions. Always remember that I give you exhaustive notes. In fact, some of you may wish I sent less to you than I've been doing, but I'd rather have you complain that I gave you more resources than you wanted, than that I didn't give you enough. So you will always have notes that cover the material that I go over, and you'll be able to review so you're fresh with it. In session 1, we made a case for life, and we did it in a minute or less. We argued from science that the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings, and we argued philosophically that there was no essential difference between you, the embryo, and you, the adult, that would justify killing you back then. The differences of size, level of development and environment, and degree of dependency, while differences indeed are not differences that justify intentionally killing you. Then in week 2, we had some fun looking at the 5 bad ways people argue. And what's great about that grid is you don't have to memorize every possible objection that's thrown your way. If you just keep those 5 bad ways in mind, you'll be able to slot people's objections into one of those 5 categories, and more than likely buy yourself the time to formulate a response and sound intelligent, even if you haven't memorized every possible objection that's out there. Then last week, we went deeper. We looked at some of the academic arguments for abortion. We looked at Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist argument, and we looked at David Boonen's desire argument. We also talked about some of the street level arguments that are out there right now, specifically things like, well, under Democrat, administrations, abortion rates actually go down, and under Republican ones, they go up or stagnate. We showed why that was not true and how that relies on faulty data, and the argument itself is bad because the pro-life position is not that we should just make abortion rare, it's that we want to make it illegal. I mean, a society that made slavery rare but still left it legal for you to own slaves would remain a deeply immoral society. So that's what we've looked at up to this point. What we're going to do tonight is develop a game plan for your pro-life convictions. Develop a game plan. And I want to take some time to do this for one very important reason. The reason why you need a pro-life game plan is because we are all apologists now. We are all hands on deck at this point. And I want to give you just a little bit of the lay of the land that we are up against right now as you think about pro-life advocacy. A lot of people think, wow, what great news. We just nominated a Supreme Court justice that if she's affirmed by the Senate, will give us a real good chance of reversing Roe v. Wade. Isn't this a sign that we're about to win this fight? And not to burst bubbles, not to inject discouragement, but I need to be honest with you. Even if Roe v. Wade were overturned, and that's by no means certain it will be, but even if it were, all that would do is return the issue to the states, and now state by state, we're going to fight this issue out, which means wherever we reside in our nation, whatever state we're in, we need to be prepared to make our case persuasively. And herein lies our biggest problem. The biggest problem confronting the pro-life movement right now is not that people have heard the pro-life case and reject it. It's that they haven't heard it at all, or at least haven't heard the most persuasive formulation of the pro-life argument. They've heard representatives give pro-life arguments, or so they thought, but they weren't good arguments. A clear, persuasive pro-life case is something vast numbers of Americans have no clue about. And we know this from our own experience at LTI. The number one comment we get from students when we walk into Catholic or Protestant high schools or secular university forums and we lay out a case for the pro-life view, by far, the number one response we get is, we've never heard this argument before. We've never heard somebody lay out a case that was so rational and so concise. We've heard a lot of religious arguments, we've heard a lot of subjective arguments, but we haven't heard a clear case. That's a tragedy. And one of the reasons these students have not heard a clear case, we have an access problem. I want you to think with me for a moment. I want you to think about the largest Christian conferences going on right now. Think, for example, of the Passion Conference. Think of Urbana. Think of any of the big evangelical conferences that go on. And ask yourself this question. If you were to view one of those conferences, or even many of them, how often would you hear any pro-life training offered whatsoever? Or let's make it even more profound. How many of those conferences even mention abortion? You'll hear talks about sexual trafficking, and that's a good topic. You'll hear topics about racism. That's a fair topic. You'll hear all kinds of discussion about poverty and economic inequality and a host of other social issues. But you would be hard pressed to find any devoted keynote session aimed at addressing abortion. It's not there. Now, it gets even more profound when you come down to the school level. You have to work pretty hard to get a school assembly at a Catholic or Protestant high school on the topic of abortion because principals fear the controversy that will result from that. If they talk about abortion, they know that there are going to be parents who don't want that discussed in their school, and they don't want to lose tuition paying students, and therefore they're shy toward this topic. And as you look at what the result of that lack of access has been, it's unbelievably profound. I'm a faculty member at Summit. Summit is a Christian worldview conference where every summer several hundred students come through, actually about 1,800 students come through for live conferences, and they get trained to defend a biblical worldview and answer objections from critics. Now, this year we had to do it virtually due to COVID, but the normal course of activity is we do these live conferences. And what I had been doing up until this year, when we didn't have students on the campus to do it, I've been asking the students after my pro-life talk, how many of you in your churches have ever heard a pro-life presentation aimed at equipping you to reach your friends who are non-Christians with the pro-life message? In other words, how many of you have heard a pro-life apologetics presentation? Out of 1,800 students over the course of a given summer, the average number of students that have heard that kind of presentation is somewhere between 45 and 60 out of 1,800. Any wonder why we're struggling right now in the culture when the very groups that are predisposed to accept our view are keeping access away from us to where we can't get our message into the very people who need to hear it? That's a tragedy. Jeff Myers issued another study out of Summit at the beginning of this summer that was also profoundly disturbing. In that study, we surveyed students that were coming into Summit, into the virtual training, and we asked this question: how many of you feel your churches are addressing the most relevant issues of the day? And the answer was an unbelievable disappointment to us, because what it came out to was about 5 to 7% of the students felt that their churches were equipping them with any kind of training at all to engage issues like homosexual marriage, abortion, theological liberalism, relativism, transgender issues. That's unbelievable that in our own churches we face these kinds of hurdles. And that's why your voice is going to be needed. And your voice will be needed to help the pro-life movement reach the very audiences that are predisposed to accept our view. Now, in addition to this challenge, I want to give you one more, and I promise this will not all be a Debbie Downer talk. I just want to give you the bad news up front, then we'll go about fixing it. Another problem we have in the pro-life movement: I want you to think about who leads the pro-abortion movement versus who leads the pro-life movement. The pro-life movement is largely led by part-time volunteers, meaning good people who are trying to fit in a little bit of pro-life work while they're busy raising kids, working their jobs, attending church, and doing all the things they need to do as good citizens. We are largely, not exclusively, but largely a movement of part-time volunteers. Who is leading the other side of this fight? Who leads the pro-abortion movement? Well, full-time professionals in medicine, law, entertainment, music, education, and we wonder why we struggle to get our message out. The other side has got full-time people dedicated to working to support abortion. As my colleague Greg Cunningham points out, there are more people working full-time to kill babies than there are working full-time to save them. That's because saving babies is very costly, while killing them is very profitable. And saving babies is so costly that large numbers of people who say they oppose abortion are not lifting a finger to stop it. And those that do lift a finger do just enough to salve the conscience, but not enough to stop the killing. Whoa. He nailed it. That's where we are as a movement. And that means we need your voice. We need you to step up and be not only equipped to know the arguments, but to convey them to people who are not going to hear them if you're not the one communicating it. So what I want to do is give you a plan, a pro-life game plan that goes beyond this training course, that takes you beyond it and allows you to make a difference in a way that can have a profound impact. And the first thing you do to have an effective pro-life game plan is to engage your local church. I want you to think back for a moment to that summit survey. Here are kids coming from some of the best churches in America to Summit to be trained in Christian worldview, and they've had no prior training in pro-life apologetics. Furthermore, they feel their churches are not engaging and equipping them to address the key issues of their day. So what would a pro-life church look like? Suppose we as pro-lifers could come up with a wish list for what we want in a pro-life church. What would that look like? Well, here's your pro-life church game plan. Number one, a pro-life church should preach, teach, and counsel that abortion is a sin, that abortion is an assault on the imago Dei, the image of God in man. And that preaching should be clear, it should not be hedged, it should be direct. Abortion, in any way you go about it, any way, whether it's chemical abortion, surgical abortion, whatever method used, is an assault on the dignity of human life, the image of God in man. And the Bible needs to be front and center in that preaching. And it's not hard to make the biblical case for the pro-life view. And a lot of times we think, well, the only way we can make that biblical case is if we go to Psalm 139 and maybe read that passage, and that'll be enough. No, it's not enough. What we need to do is lay out the full argument we see in Scripture, and here it is. Premise one, Scripture is clear that all humans have value because they bear the image of God. We see that taught in the Old Covenant in Genesis 1, and we see it taught in the New Covenant in James chapter 3 and elsewhere. Because humans bear the image of God, this would be premise 2, the shedding of innocent blood is strictly forbidden. Exodus 23:7 teaches this, Proverbs 6:16 to 19 teaches this, and Matthew 5:21, to name a few, teaches this. All right, let's take what we have right there. It's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings, or as the Bible puts it, shed innocent blood. Why? Because all humans bear the image of God. What's the only question we have left to answer here as regards abortion? That's right. Are the unborn human? Because if they are human, the same commands against the shedding of innocent blood apply to the unborn as they do everybody else. And we know from what we've already looked at in weeks 1 and weeks 2 that the science of embryology is very clear. From the earliest stages of development, you were a distinct, living, and whole human being. That means at the one cell stage, you were already an image bearer. That's the clear teaching of Scripture. So the first thing a pro-life church is going to do is convey that biblical truth about the image of God in each of us, regardless of our stage of development. The second thing, though, that a pro-life church needs to do, and if you don't help your church do this, trust me, it probably won't get done. The second thing that needs to get done that almost no church does is equip their own people to engage a culture on abortion that disagrees with us. In other words, the church should make available pro-life apologetics training. Now, that doesn't mean the pastor has to preach pro-life apologetics sermons every Sunday. We're not asking for that. But the church should have a way of systematically equipping its people to engage on the issue. And oftentimes, when churches do get something like this going, it's because pro-life apologists within the church worked toward that conclusion, worked toward that happening. And it didn't happen just because the pastor one day said, boy, I think we need this. Now, in fairness to our pastors, they are overloaded with responsibility. I know this. I was an associate pastor for 5 years. In fact, I still have a pastor's license. I can marry and bury. Well, I know what happens in pastoral work. You get overwhelmed with all kinds of tasks that you didn't sign up for. You thought you were signing up to bring the word of God, to study, to preach, and to counsel. Instead, you find out that ends up about being 7% of your time, and about 80% of your time is putting out fires, and the rest of it is miscellaneous stuff you could never predict would happen. So in fairness to our pastors, if we want to see pro-life apologetics in the church, those of us that understand pro-life apologetics need to be willing to shoulder the responsibility of getting that started in the church. What are some areas where we need to teach and equip? How about our church youth groups? Before we're done here tonight, you will know how to make a presentation at a church youth group. And I don't care if you've never done public speaking in your life, you will know how to do it because I'm going to walk you through it. Here's another group that needs to be reached: adult Sunday school classes, because those people, if they understand the pro-life position, are in a position to help support their local crisis pregnancy center with money and manpower. That's crucially important to saving lives. But the local crisis pregnancy center will not get the support it needs if there aren't sufficient numbers of pro-lifers in local churches supporting their efforts to save women and children. Another group in our local churches that needs to be reached: new believers. A lot of new converts come into the church and they don't have a Christian worldview. And you know what? That's understandable. Jesus first catches his fish, then he cleans them. That shouldn't surprise us. But what is disturbing is when new converts come into the church and they aren't exposed to how a Christian worldview impacts all areas of life, including a controversial issue like abortion. Third task our churches need to do: first, they need to preach, teach, and counsel that abortion is a sin because it violates the Imago Dei. Secondly, they need to equip their people to engage. Third thing, and this one is crucial, churches need to minister to the vast numbers of men and women wounded by abortion who've written themselves off forever having God-glorifying ministry because they've got a skeleton back there, the body of a dead child. I don't know how many post-abortion men and women I've talked to through the years, but I can tell you there's a common theme with nearly all of them. Nearly all of them feel that they really don't have a lot they can offer God because their sin has been so egregious in his sight, they reason, that they're disqualified from ever having the kind of impact that a person who had not walked the road they had walked would have. And I tell you, one of the most joyous things we can do as pro-lifers is to sit that person down and say, you're right. You are a great sinner, as am I. But Jesus is a great Savior. And if God can save the Apostle Paul, who murdered Christians, he can save men and women who've had experience with abortion. And the solution to their post-abortion pain is not avoidance. A lot of pastors, as I mentioned last week, think the best way to avoid pain is to avoid talking about abortion because they don't want to lay a guilt trip on people who may have had one. And of course, when we don't talk about abortion, we don't spare people guilt, we spare them healing because their unconfessed sin keeps them out of full fellowship with Christ. So bring the gospel as the solution to post-abortion guilt. That's what saves people. That's what heals them. And the beauty of the gospel is you can use the bad news of abortion to point people to the good news, which is their need for a Savior who is there with open arms, ready to heal them and adopt them into his family as dearly loved children. And finally, a fourth thing that a good pro-life church will do is the good pro-life church will make sure that even their youngest children get exposed to a pro-life worldview. Now, younger children should not be shown abortion pictures, but they can be taught that each of us has dignity, that our value arises out of who we belong to and whose image we bear, rather than what we do in terms of popularity or gifting or skills. That truth can be communicated at the elementary age level and should be communicated at that level. And your job as a pro-life apologist is to begin working a plan where you can see those four objectives realized in your church. We're not asking our churches to become full-time activist centers. We're actually asking them to just do those four things. We're not asking them to take on way more than they can. And by the way, their involvement in pro-life is not a distraction from the gospel. Your pastor may think that, but it's not. Because if you look at the Great Commission, we're given the command to go make disciples. That's what it says in Matthew 28. What does it mean to go make disciples? Well, the text says it's teaching people to obey all that Christ has commanded. What is one of those commands? We're not to shed innocent blood. What is abortion? The shedding of innocent blood. Therefore, abortion relates to the Great Commission responsibilities of the local church. It's not a distraction from it. So that's the essence of what a pro-life church would look like and what I hope yours could look like. The second thing we need to do is engage our local communities. I'm going to let you in on a secret, and it's not a happy secret, but here it is. Almost all the evangelical and Catholic schools that I speak in, that my speaking team at LTI speaks in, nearly all of them, we are the first pro-life speaker they've had. In other words, though they're a Christian school, no one from their own local communities has come in and taught pro-life apologetics. Now, the students have heard abstinence talks. And by the way, those are important. However, an abstinence talk or a chastity talk in a Catholic high school, those talks are not the same as convincing students that the pro-life position is true and reasonable to believe. The abstinence talks play an important role, but they are not challenging the worldview of the students when it comes to understanding the basics of the pro-life argument. It would not take a lot of work for you to begin impacting your local Catholic and Protestant high schools. So let me tell you how to do that. Right now, in the age of COVID-19, it's a little bit weird because in your area, it's quite possible that local schools are not even back, that they're strictly online. So I'll first tell you what you can do normally, then I'll tell you what you can do in the middle of COVID-19 to still have an impact. If we weren't in COVID-19, what I would tell you to do is to make contact with the theology teachers at your local Catholic high school. Be willing to go out 50 miles if you need to. I don't know how close you are to Catholic and Protestant high schools, but be willing to maybe draw a circle 50 miles out from where you live and decide you're going to contact those schools. Don't aim for a big assembly. This is a big mistake new pro-lifers make. They think, okay, he's telling me I got to go out and speak. I guess that means I got to go stand in front of 1,400 students. No, 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 no. In fact, you're not going to get the assembly. You know why? Because the school doesn't know you and they don't trust you yet. They don't know you. But here's what you can do. If you build a relationship with the local theology teacher at, let's say, a Catholic high school, or the Bible teacher at an evangelical Protestant high school, and you send over a letter from your pastor saying that you're an upstanding member in your local church and that he endorses you conveying pro-life truth to students and that he trusts you to do that work, that ministry. You could build a relationship with the local theology teacher, and here's what you ask him to do. You say to him, would you be open to me coming into one of your theology classes and giving a 20-minute pro-life talk, which, by the way, in a little bit, I'll tell you what that should look like, giving a 20-minute pro-life talk, and then just answering questions from your students. It will not be a hostile presentation. I don't want to debate your students. I will politely entertain their questions and do my best to give good answers. Would you be open to doing a trial run of that with one of your classes? Now, I'm going to tell you right now that a lot of teachers out there look at their lesson plans and they think, my goodness, I would love to have somebody to hand the ball off to one day next week. It's a load teaching students day in and day out and trying to keep it interesting. And so this teacher would say, hey, I'm willing to give that a go. You go in, you give a 20-minute talk, which we'll go over in a little bit. You field questions. Let me tell you what's going to happen, because I've done this, my speakers have done this, and many others I've trained have done this. You're going to knock it out of the park. Now, you don't think you will because you're sitting there going, I'm not a pro speaker. In a minute, we're going to shatter that illusion that you have to be a pro to be effective. You know why the students are going to listen to you? Because your content is something they've never heard. And it will be so persuasive to them in light of what they've heard on abortion prior to this point that you will engage them and they will thank you for it. So you're going to get done with that first class, we'll say at 8:30 in the morning, and the teacher's going to look at you and say, I hate to spring a last minute request on you, but I got 7 other classes coming through this room today. Are you willing to stick around for as many of them as you can make time for? And before you know it, you're leaving at 3:45 in the afternoon after talking to a couple of hundred students, 30 at a time. Now, does that make a difference in the lives of those students? You bet it does. And it's achievable. You're building a relationship with the local teacher. You convince him or her that you are trustworthy. You make your case for life. And the students are sitting there in amazement thinking, I've never heard anything like this before. And again, in just a moment, we'll show you how to do that in a way that will make a profound difference. Now, another thing you can do, and this is how we look at this in the age of COVID, what do you do right now when classrooms are not maybe in session, and even if they are, they're not really open to outside people coming in. They're trying to limit the number of outside people that come into the school in order to control the spread of the virus. Here's what you do. A lot of these schools are doing hybrid right now, and this is exactly what we're doing at LTI right now. So what we're doing is offering these schools Zoom sessions, and you can do this. They've got smart classroom technology. You sit at your computer at home, you make your pro-life case over Zoom, you entertain questions, much like we're doing right here. Imagine this kind of training, only a smaller classroom, and you give your 20-minute talk, then you take questions and interact with the students. This is something that is actually doable right now. And if you are willing to ask and willing to explore it, you can begin making a difference even right now in the age of COVID. Now, I know some of you, before I go any further, you're thinking, wait a minute, you don't understand. I hate public speaking. I'm scared to death of it. I just, you know, you're kind of talking over my head, and I'm about ready to exit out of this right now and go watch Biden and Trump debate. Don't do that. You'll lose your salvation. And I'm a Calvinist. No, just kidding. The reality is you don't need to fear this, but I want to pose a question to you as a way of getting our perspective straight. I want you to ask yourself this question. Are any of my fears about public speaking worth the price of children's lives that might have been saved had I been more courageous? That kind of puts it in perspective, doesn't it? We're not doing this for our own glory. We're doing this to please our King. All right, so how do we do presentations that can make a real difference, that can engage students, for example, or engage a community group? How do we do these presentations? How do we put material together? And what I'd like you to do is, in the chat section that you heard Steve speak about, there are notes that are posted there. There's a PDF file. I was going to do a shared screen, but when we were trying to set this up before we got online, we found that you would lose me on camera the minute I went to shared screen. So if you can access that file and somehow open it up in another window and follow me through how you actually make a presentation on pro-life issues, get that file ready. Get it open and maybe minimize it if you can for a moment until I ask you to open it up. But I want to talk to you about how you put material together for a pro-life talk. But before we do that, let me give you the objectives you'll be aiming at with this pro-life talk, because you want to know the target you're aiming at. The first thing you want to do with any pro-life presentation is you want to make sure you establish the reality of moral reasoning. Our culture thinks that morals are like ice cream. Right and wrong are strictly a matter of personal preference. Your presentation somehow, structurally, should convey that morals are real and knowable. They're not mere preferences like choosing chocolate over vanilla. The second objective your presentation should achieve is it should establish the humanity of the unborn and the inhumanity of abortion. The third thing that your presentation should do is it should reawaken moral intuitions. Fourthly, your presentation should convey a persuasive pro-life case based on science and philosophy. And by the way, you already know how to do that based on what we've covered. But again, we'll unpack that some more for you. And finally, your presentation should have as an objective, as a benchmark, handling objections persuasively and concisely. If you hit those 5 objectives, your talk is going to be a winner. Your talk will make a profound difference. You don't need to be a comedian. You don't need to be slick. You don't need to be crafty. You just need to be clear. So that's what you're aiming at. Okay, so if you would take this file, page 1 looks like this. It talks about how you're going to organize your material, and page 1 says, Step 1, brainstorming central themes. I want to go over how you would put material together. Now, option 1 is to simply use a standard presentation. And that would be one that I've already done for you. You don't need to go through this process. So let's say you get a call. It's from the local church down the street. It's a Baptist church. They have 100 high school students that meet every Wednesday night. And the youth pastor has listened to you. He has responded to your inquiry as you've approached him and said, I'd love to speak to your students on abortion. Would you let me sometime? And after getting to know you, he says, you know what, I think I would go for that. And he gives you an invitation. You've just been invited 2 weeks from Wednesday to talk to 100 high school students on abortion. What are you going to do? Well, here's option 1. Option 1 would be to just very simply go into that youth group and convey what you already know from the time we've spent together. You give a 20-minute talk, and here's what it would look like. The first thing you would do in that talk is establish that the abortion issue is not complex. It's not about choice. It's not about trusting people. It's not about privacy, for example. It's about what is the unborn. Then you would make a scientific case for the lives of the unborn. You would point out that the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. You can even use that jaguar example you heard me give in session 1, and that's in your notes, by the way, if you missed session 1, that shows that even though the unborn as the embryonic stage doesn't look like a baby, it nevertheless is a distinct, living, and whole human being. Then you can set the crowd up to view that 55-second abortion clip that was also mailed to you after week 1 in your notes. That brief video clip, 55 seconds, you don't spring it on the audience. You warn them. You tell them what's in it. You explain to them if they don't wish to watch, they can look away, that there's no narration. You will not describe what's on the screen. And before you show that film, you take just a few minutes to summarize the gospel for any who may have had an experience with abortion. You make it clear you're not there to condemn, you're not there to beat them up, but rather you're showing this clip to convey truth on an important moral issue. Then you can show the clip. Then after the clip, you can tell the story of Emmett Till to make sense of why we use provocative imagery to convey important moral truths. Emmett Till, as you may know, was the 14-year-old African-American boy who in 1955 went from Chicago to Money, Mississippi to visit his cousins in the town there. And when he got down there, he bragged that he had 2 white girlfriends back in Chicago. And upon listening to this 14-year-old boy from Chicago, the cousin and the friend said, "We don't believe you. We don't even speak to white girls down here, let alone date them." And Emmett proceeded to say, "I do have these white girlfriends." And finally, they dared him to talk to a white girl there in Money, Mississippi. Later that afternoon, the group of boys went into Bryant's grocery store in downtown Money, Mississippi, a tiny little convenience store. Emmett walked up to the counter, purchased a piece of gum from the 21-year-old married woman behind the counter, flashed her a flirtatious but innocent smile, and said, "Thanks, babe," and walked away. We think no big deal. Very big deal in 1955 if you were black. 2 nights later, that 14-year-old boy was taken at gunpoint from his uncle's home in Money, Mississippi. The woman's husband and another man drove him outside the town, and after savagely beating him and breaking nearly every bone in his upper torso, they finished him with a shot to the head and threw his corpse in the river. The local sheriff discovered the corpse, presumably 3 to 4 days later. He could not believe what he saw. He put what was left of Emmett in a box, not even a coffin, just a wood box, nailed it shut with instructions to Mamie Till, Emmett's mother, "Do not open this. You won't like what you see." When Mamie Till got the body back in Chicago several days later, she stunned the world with an announcement. She said, "We're going to have a public service for my son, and it will be an open casket funeral." People were outraged. They said, "You can't do that. Do you realize the condition your boy is in?" She said, "I know, but I want the whole world to see what they did to my boy." In that image, that black and white photo of Emmett Till in the coffin, which you can Google, be warned, it's gruesome. That image was published nationally in Jet magazine, and it launched the civil rights movement in this country. Why do pro-life speakers use imagery? Not to beat people up emotionally, not to use images in place of good arguments, but because I'm convinced, men and women, if we don't lovingly but truthfully open the casket on abortion, our nation will continue to tolerate an injustice it never has to look at. The beauty is we can also open the truth of God's word, that sinners can be reconciled to their Creator because Jesus paid in full for their rebellion. We offer truth and we offer hope. Then after you show that video, you can make a quick philosophic defense of the pro-life video. You start with science, you go to the video, then you do your SLED test. Remember SLED? There's only 4 differences between you, the embryo, and you, the adult. None of them are good reasons for saying you had no rights then and could be killed, but you do today and can't be killed. After you walk through that SLED test, which is again in your notes, you can conclude your presentation by saying, I'd love to hear from you now. What questions can I answer? And believe me, the hands will go up. And you can then just engage students. So that's one way you could do it. But suppose you want to do it yourself. You actually want to take some time to develop a talk. So if you take this handout right now, I'd like to take some time to just briefly in conclusion, walk you through how you would do that. The first step you're going to do is what we call brainstorming for central themes. And here's how you choose a central theme. You take a legal pad, just take a big legal pad, and at the top, write abortion and then a blank. And go down your page and write that about 20 times. And now fill in those blanks with whatever pops into your mind. Just brainstorm. A central theme is simply the topic you're going to address, the word and the specific aspect of that topic you're going to address. So for example, if I were brainstorming today, as I did in prep for this, I wrote down a few possibilities. By the way, these are hardly the only ones you could choose. I just made some up. You could do abortion in Christian teens or abortion in moral reasoning. In other words, how do you reason correctly on abortion? Abortion in the Bible, abortion in campus activism, abortion in politics, very relevant for our time right now, abortion and law, abortion in human rights, or any other topic you want to put in there. But your central theme will always be 3 words, abortion and then fill in the blank with whatever comes to your mind. Now, once you've done that, grab a cup of coffee and do the next part, which is to narrow down your selection of topics. So what I do, my trick here, is I assign a value to each of the central themes that I brainstorm. So if you're not already on page 2 of this document, go ahead and go there now. And so I look at my list and I see abortion in Christian teens. Well, that seems like it's relevant. I'm going to score that one a 5. I mean, after all, I've been asked to speak to the local Baptist youth group. So boy, that central theme seems to fit. Abortion and moral reasoning. Well, that also seems to fit. I'll give that a 5 as well. Abortion in the Bible. Well, it's important, but in this case, the youth pastor has a lot of non-Christian kids coming, and he wants to convince them that the pro-life position is true, and many of them don't accept the Bible. So while abortion in the Bible would be a good topic to come back to, it's probably not the best one for this first talk. So I'm going to score that one a 1. How about abortion in campus activism? I'll give that a 4. That could work. Abortion in the law. All right, I'll score that a 3 as being relevant. And then abortion in human rights, probably a little bit too philosophical for a group of high schools, so I'll give that a 3. Then step 3, go ahead and turn to page 3 at this point. I'm going to go ahead and eliminate all the central themes with a value less than 4. That way I'm sticking only with central themes that are relevant to the audience I've been asked to speak to. And you can see there which themes I eliminated and which I kept. Now flip the page, and I have chosen for this particular presentation to address the single theme that I think best fits my audience. And that theme is abortion and Christian teens. Now flip your page, if you will, to step 5. Now comes the most challenging part, but it just takes a little time. You can do this. You have to choose a thesis statement. When I was at UCLA doing my undergraduate work in English, I had a professor or a professor's assistant pull me aside after I turned in my first paper as a first-year student at UCLA. And she pulled me aside and said, do you want to pass this course? I said, yeah. And then she handed me my first paper, and the grade on it was a D+. Now I thought I'd written a great paper. She said, your paper bored me to tears. It was nothing but plot summary. You didn't argue anything. And I'm going to give you the 3 most important words for passing this course. Are you ready? I said, I'm all ears. She said, word number 1, thesis. Word number 2, thesis. Word number 3, thesis. She said, if I don't see you arguing something in your paper, it goes in the garbage can. You bet I spent time with her learning how to write with a thesis in view. And speaking is no different. You need to be arguing something. You need to be making a claim that you will defend in the course of your speech. Now, argument doesn't mean rudeness. It just means you have a point of view and you're going to defend it. So there's 2 types of thesis statements you can do in a speech. The first is an enabling speech, where you tell people how they can make a difference. The second kind of speech is an obligatory one. You tell them why they ought to do something. Choose one or the other. Don't mix them. Either choose an enabling speech that tells people how they can do something that's desired, or choose an obligatory one that helps them understand why they should do it. Either is fine, but choose one. And then step number 6, I think this is the fun part. You add your rationale. In other words, you add the main points to your thesis that defend it. So let's take the first one. Christian students can help stop abortion. Well, what's the obvious question that comes to mind? How? How? Your speech, your main points will tell the students how. Well, and by the way, I made these up. You could perhaps have other ones, but just for the sake of clarity, here's what I came up with. By simplifying the debate, showing them that the abortion issue is not complex. Number 2, by making a persuasive case using science and philosophy. And number 3, by standing for life on campus. In other words, be willing to be courageous and take the heat so you can glorify God by standing for life, even though it won't make you popular. Notice how I already have an outline for a speech. I have a clearly articulated thesis that I'm going to argue, and I have my main points that will back up my talk. This is already a speech outline. How many times have you listened to a speaker, hopefully not tonight, where you've wondered, what's the point of all this? Where is he going with this? Where is he going? He's all over the map, and you lose interest. Hopefully your pastor's not like that. When you clearly communicate where you're going with your talk, people sit up and listen. They're not used to it. So it's a great way. You don't have to be clever. You don't have to be fancy. You just need to be clear. Or if you decide to go obligatory talk, you could say this: Christian students should help stop abortion. What's the question that comes to mind? Why? Why should they? Point number 1, because abortion intentionally kills innocent human beings. That's a good reason. Point number 2, they should oppose it or help stop it because abortion undermines human rights. Yeah, it does. And number 3, because abortion harms women. Yeah, how many times have you heard stories of women who have had abortions and regretted it? By the way, if you want to go speak to that Baptist youth group, one very powerful thing you could do is you go, you give your presentation, you show that abortion video, then conclude the evening by having a woman who's had an abortion briefly give her testimony of how God redeemed her through that. And there won't be a dry eye in the place. It will be a very powerful night. Now, notice that we don't use the stories of post-abortion men and women in place of arguments, but there's no problem with adding them on after you've made your case. That can be a very persuasive way to make it personal. Okay, final thing I want to say to you about this. Never, 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 never do a speech at the last minute where you don't start prepping until the night before. Now, if there's an emergency where you're asked to fill in, it's helpful to develop a talk ahead of time that you can pull up and go with in an emergency. But always give your time, or give the time needed to let your talk ferment in your own mind. And on the last page of this little handout that I gave you, Let me explain what you're looking at there. Take my talk, Christian Teens Can Help Stop Abortion. And you'll notice along the top here, I have written my rationale, my three main points that support that thesis. And under each of them, you'll notice that I just wrote down one-word ideas. Well, how can I help simplify the abortion issue? Well, showing that abortion video will help. I say this, kill this question. That's an example we use called Daddy, Can I Kill This? Which is in your notes. And that's a simple illustration. If you're standing at your kitchen sink washing dishes and your 5-year-old boy comes in behind you with your back turned and says to you, Daddy or Mommy, can I kill this? What's the first question you're going to ask? What has he got? Cockroach, snail, do whatever you want with it. Don't show your mom. Neighbor kitty, whoa. And brother by the throat, you have issues. In other words, you can never answer the question, can I kill this, till you know what it is. And that applies to the abortion issue. Can we kill the unborn? Yes, if. If what? If the unborn are not human. But we got to answer the question, what is the unborn, before we answer the question, can I kill the unborn? Then under persuasive case, you'll see that I have science and SLED, all of which you are well aware of at this point. And then understand strong on campus, I talk about Jamie and a story about Stephanie Gray. I may also bring in a story, a Civil War or historical example that might showcase what courage looks like. But what this does is if you got a week or 10 days ahead of your talk, if you just down the side of your legal pad, write the word that illustrates your main point, and just underneath it, brainstorm any ideas that come to mind. You'll be shocked. You'll be out on a run and you'll think of an illustration that goes, oh, that'll fit perfect on that rationale point in my talk. And you can jot it down and it brings your talk to life. It allows you to just catalog and keep track of what your mind is working with. And that's the beauty of having a structure to your talk. You're able to organize your ideas and keep track of your thoughts and then communicate them in a clear way. So let's review what we talked about tonight, then we're going to go to your questions. The first thing we talked about is you need a pro-life game plan. And a pro-life game plan involves doing a number of things. The first thing you need to have a game plan is you need to be willing to engage your local church. You also need to be willing to engage your local community. You need to be willing to reach out to your schools. And then you also need to overcome your fear of speaking. We're all apologists now. There is one last thing I'll give you, and that is this. The best way to build your confidence as a pro-life apologist is to read well. In the notes you've already been given, there are book references, books that you should read. For example, Patrick Lee's book, Abortion and Unborn Human Life. There's my book, The Case for Life. You want to master the pro-life position? Here's an idea. Take my book, The Case for Life. At the end of every chapter, I give you discussion questions or review questions. Answer those questions. Read the chapter, highlight the parts that stick out, then see how well you do answering the review questions at the end of each chapter. You will master that material. You will know it well enough to communicate. And there's other books I mentioned in that list, but you want to become very skilled at mastering the pro-life position. And it doesn't take 2 years of reading. You can do this in a couple of months and be ready, and you'll be confident when you stand in front of people to convey your pro-life position. Well, I've given you a lot to chew on. You'll be happy to know that the notes that I'm going to send you at the end of this session will cover all of this. It'll bring it all back into motion for you. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, I would love to do debates. Honestly, that's a rare breed that wants to do that. I happen to be one of those that likes doing debates. You're welcome to go on YouTube and watch my Wayne State debate with Nadine Strawson, for example, if you want. But in the notes, I will include a section on debates. But since for the vast majority of you, it's enough that you go approach your church youth group and your local school, your Catholic and Protestant high schools, that will be amazing enough. But if you want to study debate, it'll be there for you. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Steve and take whatever questions you might have for me, and we'll conclude our time together.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. Not only for tonight, but also for the entire series here. Hopefully this has been helpful to people, and hopefully your call to action will be helpful and remember. So starting with questions, I'm going to start with an easy one. It was the last one that came in from Stephen. UCLA, how did you survive with your mind intact?
That's a great question. Oh, man. I've been asked a number of times, are you a Christian? You went to UCLA? Well, think of the alternative. You could go to USC, the University of Spoiled Children. So I didn't go there. They're our rivals, by the way, in case anybody is unclear. What was interesting about UCLA, when I was there as an undergraduate student, the English department was conservative. UCLA at that time had one of the best English departments in the world. My Chaucer professor was mentored by J.R.R. Tolkien, and he had spent time with Lewis hanging out in the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford. So I had a wonderful English experience there that really helped me learn how to organize thoughts, helped me with public speaking. And I'm eternally grateful to God that he made that available to me. But, you know, by the time I got into UCLA, my Christian worldview was intact. And I wasn't there to absorb the culture, absorb the campus environment or the campus vibe. I wanted to go in there, get my studies done. And other than having season tickets to football and basketball, I had no interest in really hanging out socially. And before, you know, while I was at UCLA, I was married. So I just wasn't in the party scene or any of that. And I think that's why I was able to preserve. But I think one of the things that really helped me, I was firmly committed to a Christian worldview by the time I got there. And so many of our students today are not. And they're sent off to secular schools, ill-equipped to handle what they're going to be confronted with. And that's why your willingness to go into church youth groups and Catholic and Protestant high schools can make a real difference, because you can inoculate them against the kinds of things that they will hear once they get to a school like UCLA.
Yep, good. You know, one of the central things you talked about was approaching your church, your pastor or pastoral staff. A couple of questions came in. Unfortunately, kind of came around the fact that they have tried that and they are not being supported, or their pastor is not receptive to the pitch. And you talked about that a little bit earlier, but can you expand on that in terms of any techniques you've seen where you can overcome initial objection?
Yeah, sadly, there will be cases where you are not well received. That's true. Here's the general rule for success. If your pastor is not more brokenhearted over abortion than he is terrified about preaching about it, he's going to remain silent. Pastors who are brokenhearted over abortion will do whatever it takes to get a pro-life structure into their churches. If they're not brokenhearted, they're not going to assume the risk. I mean, if you're a pastor, let's think about it for a moment. You look out over your congregation. Let's say it's a church of 1,000 people. You know good and well there's probably 250 to 300 people sitting out there on a given Sunday who've had experience with abortion. Not just women who had abortions, but men who encouraged their daughters or wives or girlfriends to abort, and the female friends that encouraged that woman to abort. And those people are going to incur incredible psychic pain when you bring up a topic like abortion. They just are. Now, just because a topic is painful does not mean we shouldn't preach on it. Preaching on pride is going to be painful to a lot of people. Preaching on lust or any other deadly sin is going to be painful. That doesn't mean we're relieved of our responsibility to teach, preach the whole counsel of God. So your pastor needs to be broken-hearted over abortion. And that's where that 55-second video clip we've given you might be a tool you can use. You graciously approach your pastor and say, Pastor, would you be willing for just a moment to let me show you something here on my phone. Would you be willing to look at it? Let me tell you what it is, and then I'll tell you why I want you to see it. And then I just want to ask you a couple of questions. And if you can do that, it's possible that the visuals will move him from being just status quo pro-life to where he's behaviorally pro-life and willing to make a difference. Now, how do I know this? I was that pastor. So Steve, to just level here, in November of 1990, I had been an associate minister at a church in Southern California. If you had asked me if I was pro-life, I would have told you yes, but I was not lifting a finger to stop the killing. And the local crisis pregnancy center director, Lois Cunningham, God bless her, she would bug me to get involved. And I would keep coming up with excuses. And other than going to their annual banquet and giving an obligatory $100, I really didn't do much. Well, finally, I agreed to go to a pastor's gathering where she had a speaker who laid out a case for the pro-life view, Greg Cunningham, who Lois eventually married, by the way. And he laid out a case for the pro-life view. And then he showed an image of abortion. He showed an 8-minute video depicting abortion. I wept because I knew that I was no different than the priest and the Levite who passed by on the other side of the road in the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that imagery changed how I felt. And it wasn't long after that I was doing those same presentations in the college and high school groups of our church. I preached in my church on abortion. And then 6 months later, with the blessing of my church, I left to pursue full-time pro-life apologetics. So I know that you have to change often how people feel as a predicate to changing how they think and ultimately behave. So that's one way you can go. Another way is to work for second order leaders in the church and see if they'll let you come into their Sunday school classes. Work through the youth pastor to reach the youth group. Sometimes the senior minister does not require involvement in every decision of this sort. So you could try that. But I get it. It's not always easy. And my hat is off to those of you that try.
Well, thanks. One of the thoughts that occurred to me as you said that, I mean, sharing your personal story was important, but the flow chart, the brainstorming and the thesis that you talked about for the class, people should prepare the same for the pastor, right? So you also don't want to hit the pastor up before you've prepared your argument.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point, Steve, because a lot of times what pro-lifers do is they walk into the pastor's office and they just unload on him. They, you got blood on your hands. You're not preaching on this. I've never heard you speak on abortion. You need to be hitting this issue. Well, that doesn't really help the pastor. But what if you say to the pastor, Pastor, I think you and I share a common goal, a common concern. We think believers should be salt and light in the culture. We think that believers should be equipped to engage with people who don't share our worldview. And one of those important issues where we need to engage is the pro-life issue. Is there a way we as a church could approach the abortion issue, not out of guilt, not out of heavy-handed activism, but as an equipping ministry to make believers salt and light on the issue? I think that's a much better way to frame it than going in there with a guilt trip and just dumping on the pastor.
Yeah, that's a good point. By the way, you brought up the story of Emmett Till. You brought up the video. One of the questions that came from Dan had to do with non-surgical abortions and the feeling like in 3 years there'll be lots more invisible abortions, if you will, and therefore the imagery and all may not be as powerful or as potent. What are your thoughts about the trends there? Obviously, the moral case is the same, but the evidence is different.
Yeah. Will the video still work in the case of medicalized abortions, meaning RU46 abortions, methotrexate abortions, or the drug Ella type abortions? We've been told for now 25 years that RU46 and chemical abortions were going to put surgical abortions off the map. That has not happened. Large percentages of women do not opt for chemical abortions because it's no walk in the park to do that. It can be a very painful and very difficult procedure that can last with a heavy cramping load, and it can go on for several days. And recognizing that, a lot of women would prefer to just do it surgically. So surgical abortions are going to remain with us as long as abortion is legal in this country. And the vast majority of abortions are surgical abortions. So the film still speaks to those. But our facts and arguments address those that aren't surgical. And you're right, Steve, the argument remains exactly the same.
Right. So a couple of questions came in. I mean, you obviously talked about the church and the schools. So obviously there was a focus there on younger, well, certainly on the school side, younger thing. A couple of people asked questions about have interacted with people on Facebook. So any thoughts about making the case could be somebody could be a friend, an extended friend. Obviously, a very different medium. It's not face-to-face. You're not having the same kind of impact. What are your thoughts about engaging in this issue with people on Facebook?
Yeah, what about social media interactions? I'm going to say up front that I can't say that I have persuaded truckloads of people on social media to adopt the pro-life view. What I think I can do on social media is give them something to think about. But social media is such a distracting medium, and it is such a intense media that people tend to just want to win the fight and not really read and engage. How often have we seen somebody challenge something that we say on social media? We feel this overwhelming need to answer them right now before we go to bed for the night type thing. That's the nature of the medium. And with all the trolls that are out there, it can be tough. So what I would say on social media is try to be brief, concise, and post things that give people something to think about. And that may be the best you can do. It's really difficult on social media to lay out an exhaustive argument and expect that anybody's going to read it. Some people do, and certain times of the year you can get away with that. In January, around the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, election cycles, sometimes you can do that, like right now. But overall, it's a tough medium. I think in addition to social media engagement, you need to look for public speaking in-person events where you can lay out your case and persuade people in a more agreeable format that works for conversation, works for engaging ideas, better than the quick hits of social media.
Good. So William asked a question. I'm gonna take liberty and expand on the question a little bit. So William's question was, which pro-life groups do you believe are the most effective? Now it's a little bit of a loaded question to push you on the spot a little bit, but I think if we broaden that, you've talked a lot about education, trying to get into schools and churches to educate.
Yeah.
People. Obviously, there's sidewalk counselors. There's legislative organizations, there's crisis pregnancy centers, one-on-one counseling, so when you think about the ecosystem that is the pro-life movement, and obviously some of this is going to be what people are called to do, but how would you grade the effectiveness of not only organizations, but maybe the different types of labor that people can apply here?
Yeah, well, let me start with the first one you mentioned, pregnancy resource centers. Some of them do phenomenal work. They engage high percentage of abortion-minded women, and their operational resources are organized and aimed at stopping abortion. There are other pregnancy centers that I think bite off more than they can chew. They are out there to try to fix all kinds of things wrong with society. They want to prevent fathers from abandoning their children. They want to prevent family breakdowns. They want to strengthen marriages. And they think that in order to be pro-life, you have to be pro-abundant life or whole life. Mm-hmm. And the problem there is, as Frederick the Great once said, he who fights everywhere fights nowhere. We end up diluting our already scarce resources even thinner, fighting all these other injustices when our efforts really need to be aimed at stopping abortion. But the vast majority of pregnancy centers that I've seen do a very good job reaching out to that abortion-minded woman. A lot of them have gone medical clinic, meaning they can provide medical services that allows the woman to see her child on ultrasound. Many others are doing mobile ultrasound units where they actually go to where the most vulnerable clients are. That's fabulous work. So as you look at a pregnancy center, the main question you want to ask is, are they mainly doing social relief work, or are they truly targeting women most at risk for abortion? And I think that overall, pregnancy center ministry has gotten a lot better at doing that. And my hat is off to them for that. Other groups that I think do terrific work. Well, let's put some credit right where it belongs, obviously. The Colson Center does a fabulous job keeping people up to date on pro-life issues, the worldviews lurking behind a lot of these abortion choice arguments. So obviously, those of us watching right now want to stay tuned in here. Some other pro-life groups that I think do terrific work. Created Equal. This is a group that trains students in pro-life apologetics over the course of an entire summer. Then they are turned loose to be campus leaders when they go off to the university. They give these students not only great schooling in the apologetics, but these students actually go out and engage people on the street. And they learn how to talk about abortion against the backdrop of the pictures. They put warning signs up so people aren't forced to look at pictures, but they get the message out there. And I love the work that Created Equal does. I think our group, Life Training Institute, does a great job getting into schools and giving pro-life apologetics presentations. If you're looking for some more politically minded groups, Americans United for Life does a terrific job reaching those that are in political office with pro-life content. I mean, I could go on. And what I'll do before I finish the notes for tonight, I'll add a list of groups that I think are out there really making a difference. One other group that I think is phenomenal in Canada is a group called the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. They have got some of the sharpest young philosophers in that group that really nail this worldview stuff. And it's really nice to watch them. There's a group called Protect Life Michigan that is probably the most effective student campus group I've ever seen. They bring me in every year, and I provide graduate level training to their leadership core, and they make sure their students know what they're talking about, and these kids will take anything on. They are not afraid to stand up at secular universities and make the case. There's other groups out there like Students for Life of America, Justice for All. I mean, there's a lot of good groups. I feel a little bit strange only mentioning a few, but there you go. That's a start.
Well, no, it's helpful. I think that a lot of times people don't know that there's there's an ecosystem here, and
Yeah.
to have an effective movement, you need all the parts. It's like
By the way, I'm going to give kudos here to someone that's on this call or on this webinar. From Northern Ireland, Susan DeBoer. Here's a woman that could very well decide that, hey, you know what? I've worked most of my life. I'm ready to hang it up and just relax. She is starting a pro-life apologetics effort in Northern Ireland. She's watching right now, and I'm embarrassing her to death. I'll probably get an email right after this ends, bawling me out. But just an example, she's not a professional speaker, but she's been out talking to pastors. She emails me once a week. Hey, I'm going to see this pastor. I want to make sure I'm doing this right. I'm going to go try to speak to this group. She's just inviting herself to speak, which is exactly what we have to do. People aren't going to call us up and invite us to come speak. So she goes after them, and she's just saying, hey, I'm going to take the tools I get and make a difference. So my hat is off to her, and I'm sure there are others watching on this that do the same thing. I'm just not aware of you. But feel free to email me if that's what you're doing.
In fact, we had a nice email from Sheila who said that she's using our What Would You Say videos on pro-life. In fact, as you know, since you helped us write them, last week's script and What Would You Say was on the life issue, and tomorrow's script is on late-term abortion. And so she's using the pro-life videos and the videos from your prior weeks in some work at her local schools. So we definitely got some thank yous as well. You brought up legislation, and that's obviously a broad one. Jonathan asked a question: why do you think pro-life legislators vote against bills that seek the total and immediate abolition of abortion? Isn't this backwards? An example is SB 13 in Oklahoma, voted against by a pro-life majority in February of this year.
Yeah. Now, each bill is going to be different given the context and the circumstances surrounding it. But let me answer a general response to that. The reason why some pro-life legislators work incrementally rather than for total abolition of abortion is because they know that the federal courts are going to strike down a total ban, and we're going to end up going nowhere. Now we got more case law stacked up against us. And they would rather work incrementally to do the greatest good they can, given what they have in front of them as current political realities, to save as many lives as they can, given what's against us, while continuing, and here's the key point, while never giving up on total abolition. And this gets to what I talked about last week. We should all be committed to principle abolitionism, but we incrementally work at the practical level to save as many lives as we can. All pro-lifers want to see the end of abortion, but we do have to be wise in how we approach it. And if we're putting forth a bill that we don't have the votes for, or is going to get struck down at the federal courts, we may feel good that we took a stand on principle, but what about the children that would have been saved had we been a little wiser and worked incrementally until we actually did have the votes to get done what we needed? I think that's an important point. And I've asked a couple of abolitionists this question. If you knew abortion could be done with in 30 years, pursuing an incremental policy, would you support that? Would you support it even if you knew that if you worked for total abolition, it would take 50 years? If given the choice, total abolition, it will take 50 years if you don't work incrementally, or we can get there in 30 if we work incrementally. Would you agree to work incrementally? Almost all of them say no, and I don't understand that. So I'm not questioning their principles. I'm not questioning their hearts, but I think there is a point where seasoned legislators know that politics is the art of getting done what you can get done, and that sometimes you just don't have the votes to get done everything you'd want to get done. So in that case, you're going to limit the evil and pursue the good as much as possible, given the realities confronting you.
Yeah. Well, and God willing, Amy Coney Barrett is put on.
Agreed.
That may change
now,
the 3D chess game that people are playing with respect to what's going to happen when it eventually gets to the Supreme Court, right?
Exactly. And by the way, if there is a pro-life politician where we have a chance to pass a strong bill that can pass judicial muster, let's say we get some change on the federal courts that really does begin to change abortion jurisprudence, either by limiting the power of the federal courts or by getting a more pro-life jurisprudence in place, we should go for the strongest bills we can. Absolutely.
So going back and forth here on the questions. So there's, this one comes from Dan. So and again, I think it goes to, I think week 2, some questions there, but how do you fight the answer that comes from someone you're speaking with who says, I agree it's wrong, but I'm not willing to give up the gains that have been made in women's rights over the decades. So this is obviously goes back to anyway, you know the question.
Well, my first question would be, which women? Are unborn women helped by these so-called abortion gains? Notice the objection assumes the unborn are not human. Do unborn women gain when it's legally permissible to butcher them? The answer is no. So the argument assumes the unborn aren't human. It's that begging the question fallacy we spoke about in week 2. And if you missed that one, you'll want to review that on the 5 bad ways people argue. So the argument assumes the unborn are not human. Secondly, Notice how this argument is actually anti-woman, because what it's basically asserting is that the only way women can achieve equality with men is to have a special surgery. Whoa, how is that equality? I prefer the biblical model. Men and women equally are image bearers and require no additional surgery, no additional add-on to be valuable human beings. They are so already in virtue of whose image they bear. So I don't think that argument is pro-woman at all. I think it's actually condescending to women.
Wait, back to the ecosystem, Julie reminded us focus on the family should be mentioned in this context as well. So
Absolutely focus on the family, and thank you for bringing that up. In fact, we are about to at LTI email out to our entire list the Sea Life 2020 that Focus on the Family just did. We pushed it on our own social media, and great presentation there. Yeah, one of the big ones I forgot. How did I forget that one? Especially since they've been so generous to me to have me on their program, what, 20 times? So that was a big error on my part. But yes, Focus on the Family.
It wasn't intended to call you out. It was just intended to add.
And yeah, also, right. Yeah, no, Steve.
Well, say a little bit about the event that was held just this last weekend, the Sea Life 2020.
Well, they did a number of things. They had some great speakers like Lila Rose, Abby Johnson. I think they had J.C. Watts, the former football player, Benjamin Watson. I'm trying to think who else they had. But they had a number of people, some who are celebrity status, but all of them conveying essentially the same thing, that pro-life is a central issue. It's at the heart of who we are as a people, and we got to get this issue right. And I was impressed with the presentations I saw. They're not lengthy. They're all engaging and worth the time.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to pass on from Susan. She says, I cannot recommend Scott's teaching highly enough. When I spoke to our government building, Stormont, Scott helped and encouraged me. So a huge thank you, Scott. So passing on encouragement. Since I busted you about Focus on the Family, I figured I needed to.
Thank you. You know, that's good to know. You got to make up some ground there.
Got to make up some ground. So. Okay, well, we're in the waning moments, and I'm sure, I think we've lost some folks to the debate. You're probably going to jump on the debate yourself when this is wrapped up. End of week 4, any closing words you'd like to leave everybody with?
Yeah, here is my parting challenge to you. You've had 4 weeks of training. What should happen in your life is you should move from being attitudinally pro-life to behaviorally pro-life, where you actually take what you have learned and apply it. What my colleague Greg Cunningham says is so right on, that most people who say they oppose abortion do just enough to salve the conscience and not enough to stop the killing. We got to do better than that. So small steps, I'm fine with small steps. Maybe you talk to your home group on pro-life. You take what you learned here this week and you talk to them. Or maybe you talk to your Sunday school class. It doesn't matter. And I don't care if you think you mess up the presentation. It will still be way better than if you did nothing. So trust the Lord to protect the pro-life message. You're not going to you're not going to boggle it up. Don't worry. Take what you've learned and convey it to as many people as you can in your sphere of influence, and let God take care of the rest.
Wonderful. That was a good closing message and a good call to action. So thank you, Scott. And
thank you, Steve.
Thank you for joining us. And as we mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out the recording of tonight's session, as well as some notes and some additional things that Scott agreed to add on. So blessings, everyone. Take care.